Hi everyone, this is Andrew from Schoolism. Today I'll be talking to you about some of the little brush settings for custom brush that you might or might not know about. This video will be a little bit more specific to brush that I use when I'm sketching. And the reason I want to talk about this is because one of the questions I get most from students when I'm teaching my course is what brush do I use to draw, and how they don't really feel comfortable sketching or drawing in Photoshop as compared to when they're drawing on paper and pencil. And this is because the default brush in Photoshop, which is this circle brush, I assume that's what most people start using when they're starting Photoshop. The feeling of this brush is actually quite different than pen and pencil. And for me, this brush actually feels a little bit more like sketching with paint rather than pencil. The property and the default settings of this circle brush in some way acts a little bit more like when you're painting with acrylic or gouache. And because when you're drawing with pencil, for example, if I'm just drawing a circle and you start cross-hatching, things get darker and darker as you add on more strokes. And when you're drawing on pen and pencil, usually what happens is you'll probably start off with a really faded line, just really light, just starting on the general outline of your drawing. But as you try to refine your drawing a little bit more, you probably go over it a little bit by little. And then for pencil, basically the colors will become darker and darker as you put on more strokes on the paper. But with the default brush, it doesn't really work that way. I'm going to do a quick demonstration of the difference right here. So I have a brush right here. So if I just keep painting on this brush, you realize no matter how much I draw on this area, basically it becomes as dark as the color that I'm choosing right now. So I have medium gray right now. So it doesn't really get darker. So what happens is if I'm doing a lot of sketches and scribble on a paper and putting a lot of lines on the page, eventually what I end up with is this kind of really big bunch of scribble that kind of merge into each other, and all these strokes just kind of start to blend into each other. And this is where the settings that I'll be talking about comes into play. This is a little thing that I wish I knew when I was first starting with Photoshop, and I think a lot of artists that I know actually didn't know about this setting, or at least for me I didn't know until really later on. So that setting's right here at the top, whereas there's this brush and usually it's at normal. But if you set this on multiply, what you'll find is you do a stroke, and when you do another stroke, it'll get darker and darker until it goes to black, and it can't get any darker. So how does this work in terms of sketching? So it works in the sense that what I mentioned before, if I was doing the circle and I'm just doing some type of cross hatching on top, the more I go on top, basically it will get darker and darker and darker. Whereas previously, if there was set on normal, it will be kind of like this example at the top, where it would just go as dark as the color you choose. So obviously you could choose, for example, black. The color might start out a little bit too dark right here, and then it becomes a little bit hard to kind of control the brush sensitivity. So what I usually do a lot is I will set it as multiply, and I'll choose a medium gray. So as I slowly start to refine it or anything, my brush strokes will always remain visible. So I could really use this one brush, and without going back and forth to pick colors for the shadow, the areas I want to be a little bit darker, then I'll just go back in and paint over it, and it'll basically become darker. So this is one setting that you could really play around with for this multiply option right here. Another option that I find really helpful is this flow. I call this kind of like the dry marker settings. When you're having a Sharpie that's kind of running out of ink, if you change the flow to really, really low, so this is kind of what happens. It makes the brush feel like it's kind of like a marker that's running out of ink. So I'm just going to demonstrate right here. So right here I'm choosing a black color. When I first start to sketch with this, doing the first time, it comes out as a very, very light gray. But as I keep on going back and forth, you'll realize it gets darker and darker and darker. So this is a little bit similar to this multiply. But the difference with this and the multiply is that for the multiply brush, when I create a stroke right here, I will have to lift up my tablet and I'll create another stroke before it multiplies and gets darker. And I'll lift up my pen again and create another stroke, and it gets darker, and I create another stroke. So multiply is basically every stroke you make, it will multiply the colors for the colors below, so things will get darker as you continue to make the strokes. But for the flow, if you set it to really, really low, you don't have to lift up the pen, and then you just have to keep going back and forth at one area, and it will continue to get darker. So I'm just going back and forth on one area and scribble and it'll get darker. You see the difference right here is on multiply again. I'm just going to go back. It doesn't really get darker and darker even if I continue to go on top of it. Right now I'm choosing black. Actually, I'll just choose a gray, for example. So if I go for gray, unless I lift up my pen, basically even if I keep going over the same areas over and over, just scribbling back and forth, it kind of remains a similar color. And I'm going to lift up my pen right now and go back, and then it becomes darker. So it depends really on how you sketch in real life, so that you could choose which settings is more appropriate for you. You could have a combination of both. You could have just multiply or just the flow. So if you are a person that do a lot of strokes, this multiply setting might work a little bit better for you. If you do a lot of cross hatching, for example. But if you are someone that doesn't lift up the pen as much, then you could maybe use kind of like this dry marker. You just keep going back over an area and the colors will become darker. So this is the first part of the brush setting. So you could play around with the multiply and the flow.